Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Dr. Eric Helms. This might now hold the record for the longest gap between appearances. So you were originally on the old format of the show with my old co-host, Dean Guido, for episode number 70. So this one will be somewhere in the 370s. So it's over 300 episode gap. It's an honor to have you back.
Well, you've been killing it, man. Obviously, anytime a podcast stays around that long, you're obviously doing something right. So it is a pleasure, a privilege, and an honor. And good to see you again.
Forever humble. And yeah, the last time I would have seen you outside of that would have been you presented here in 2018. You were in Edmonton
right.
at a fitness conference called the L2 Fitness Summit. And for those of listeners who are not super familiar with your legacy in the industry, because you are, a very influential figure. I know humble as hell. PhD, co-founder of Team 3DMJ, co-founder of the Mass Research Review, Auckland University of Technology Senior Research Fellow, certified strength and conditioning coach, WNBF Pro Bodybuilder, co-author of, I've got them right here, The Muscle and Strength Pyramid. So there's multiple books in this series. These are great, guys, for real. Check this stuff out. Got to give you the shout out initially. And, one of the most respected resources, certainly in muscle hypertrophy, bodybuilding, nutrition. So let's dive right in. How much muscle can the average person reasonably expect to build in a year in their lifetime? Talk to me about this.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for the intro. And I think the average person reasonably expect to build is a really good framing, because I think we often, if in my world, like I said, like you mentioned, I'm heavily kind of embedded in the drug-free bodybuilding space. So the questions I often get are, what is my maximum muscular potential, or what's the most I can build in a given time frame? But I think if we frame it that way, someone is going, all right, I'm going to commit a significant portion of my life, but I'm not going to become a bodybuilder. And what am I going to get in this first year? I think if we look at some of the normative values of what do we see in, beginners putting on muscle over a given time period who are training with reasonable amounts of volume 3 days a week, let's say, for example, I think most people can typically expect to increase their skeletal muscle mass by about like 10% over a year, which ain't nothing, So what would that actually look like in your life and in your world? That often looks like a body weight increase somewhere between like 6 to 8%. So if you are 160 pounds, you might be able in a year to increase your body mass up to around 170, and you might look a little leaner, or just similar level of your body fat might go up a little bit, but it'll probably go up less than your amount of lean mass. So technically your body fat percentage either goes down or stays roughly the same while you're adding body weight. That also squares with my experience as a personal trainer. I was a personal trainer for the first half of my career, essentially starting around 2005. And I, it's rare that you get someone who comes in and says, hey, I want to come train with you to get as huge as possible in commercial gyms for personal training clients. But I did have them. And certainly, while 3D Muscle Journey is focused mostly on doing online coaching for people very serious about physique sport, competitively or non-competitively, but trying to get as big as they can, trying to get as strong as they can, we occasionally do get people who are pretty fresh out the box. So, yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Renaissance Periodization and the RP Hypertrophy app. RP is the industry leader in muscle building, coaching, and education. This app is like having a coach in your pocket. It gives you everything you need, including training programs, form videos. It gives you all your sets, reps, and weights, so you just show up and follow the plan. It adjusts each week based off your progress. And the app was created by Dr. Mike Israetel, Nick Shaw, and the team at RP, who I've known for many years. And the entire team are incredible people who've always been supportive and generous with me, so I know their character and are easy to endorse. My library contains several RP books, and I've used RP training principles in my workouts and coaching with my clients for many years, long before the explosion in popularity of their YouTube channel, which is worth checking out. RP is the first sponsor I felt remotely comfortable endorsing after over 7 years of podcasting. And if hiring a one-on-one coach isn't for you, Using the RP Hypertrophy app is the next best thing to maximize your gains and take the guesswork out of your program. And there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free. If you don't like it, they'll give you your money back. And I've also got a serious discount for you of up to $50 US. Go to rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP, or go to the link below in the show notes, and that's rpstrength.com/coats. Use the code COATSRP.
Let's break it down between men and women. So the way I phrase it in my interpretation research is men and women can build muscle equally effectively relative to their starting point. Can you explain that?
Yeah, exactly. So this comes down to the difference between absolute versus relative change, right? So the average male is 20 pounds heavier than the average female, maybe more, depending upon what country we're talking about, right? So, and the heights differ, and this largely has to do with puberty and the different changes the two biological sexes make when they go through it. So you get this higher baseline. That's essentially what the exposure to testosterone does during that period. Is it bumps you up in terms of, you know, height, weight, and skeletal muscle mass, and you see differences in essential body fat levels between men and women. So that would make you see in kind of your real world observations as a trainer, or if you have a partner of the opposite sex, you guys both start training and it looks like they're putting on more muscle than you. But in an absolute sense, that may be true. You know, they might put on 15 pounds of muscle, you might put on 8. But I think what you might be forgetting is they could be 6'2" and you could be 5'2". And they could have started out at 18% body fat, and you could have started out at 27% body fat. So those differences might actually be quite similar from a percentage change perspective. And that's been borne out in many studies, to the point now we have multiple meta-analyses. So studies of studies that compare sex differences. And when you compare sex differences in a relative sense, you correct, or not necessarily correct, but you just express it as a percentage change, there aren't systematic differences between men and women in terms of how much muscle they gain. So I think you characterize that perfectly, even though you might see a difference of, say, on average, a 7-kilo increase in men versus a 4.55, 5.5 kilo increase in women. I'm just kind of off the top of my head. So when you look at the relative amount of lean body mass at baseline, or cross-sectional area, or muscle thickness, the most common measures we have, either looking at ultrasound, MRI, or some two-compartment model of body composition, you really consistently see quite similar increases in terms of strength. And that also applies, for hypertrophy, and that also applies to other performance metrics, strength, et cetera, adaptations to resistance training in a broader sense.
This episode is brought to you by KNKG, my favorite gym bag brand. For years, I did two stupid things. I bought cheap gym bags, which eventually fell apart, and I traveled with and checked a big suitcase. KNKG changed all that. In 2020, my aunt bought me a KNKG. Back then, they were known as King Kong duffel bag. Here it is. 5 years later, it's still indestructible. And last year, I spent hours on YouTube researching backpacks for travel. And I kept coming back to the KNKG Edge, which now goes everywhere with me. Travel, gym, work. I also just got a KNKG Conquer backpack and their Plus duffel bag. And these are both perfect for the gym. My main issue is I have too many bags and I can only use one at a time. Investing in high quality gear means you save money in the long run too. And I can save you guys 15% on yours. Go to www.knkg.com/Andrew59676. That's www.knkg.com/Andrew59676, or go to the link in the show notes. Now, talked about sort of probably the averages, the expectations. And all research exists on a bell curve, which means there are outliers, both under responders and, what we call genetic freaks. So what can we see in terms of a range within the population? Are there people who, no matter what, just simply are unable to put on muscle, or is it just really it's really slow and kind of minimal? And what are kind of the genetic ceiling we're seeing for natural bodybuilders?
Yeah, this is one I think terminology becomes really important, and understanding the limitations of research. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the vast majority of studies which purport to say that there are responders and non-responders and they make that sound like it is a trait of that participant, actually can't do that. All we can say is that for this study, for this 12-week period, 8-week period, 24-week period, that person had, by some definition, a higher or lower response. That can be determined based upon the measurement error of the device you're looking at and how high above it you were. That can be determined by looking at quartiles, which is essentially just breaking up a group of participants in a study into the top 25%, middle 25% on the high end or the low end of the median, or the bottom 25%, right? So percentiles, essentially, and going, okay, what's the difference between the people in the top percentile and the lower percentile? And the danger of looking at it that way and assigning this as a trait to the person is that all of us who have lifted for a while can think of a 12-week period where we trained hard, wanted to gain muscle, and not much happened. And sometimes that even occurred early on in our career. And that might have been because we were super stressed. That might have been because we didn't realize it, but we were tracking macros for the first time, trying to be in a surplus. We were under eating. That could have been simply that we seemed to respond to a certain type of training, and that was very different than what was in the study. Or, especially in trained individuals, you're doing a high volume of training, a high degree of frequency, and you get put in a study where you're actually decreasing volume, even though that wasn't the intention of the study. And we have seen more and more data on considering the baseline level of work and adaptation that a participant has, at least when we're doing research in trained individuals. So that's a really important caveat. If you actually want to, and this is an academic point that I won't spend too much time on, determine responsiveness in an individual, it's actually incredibly challenging from a research perspective. And big shout out to Dr. Zach Robinson, who's still working through his PhD data, because this is what he did, is he had a within participant design. So your own control. You have your left and your right arm, and they're assigned to different types of training protocols. And then you think, okay, cool. Now I can tell which one I respond better to. Well, maybe, but what we actually have to do is then cross you over and repeat it to see when you have your left and right limb assigned to different protocols, what is the random difference? And I shouldn't say random. What is the variability in that response that could be related to factors not specific to the training program? Because unfortunately, you or I, and we know this because we've been lifting for a long time, we could repeat the exact same protocol and we would get different results. And not just because we are more or less advanced, but because we're adaptive systems, and technically, we're not even the same organism that we were a year ago. Almost all those cells are completely replaced. And we are in a different environment, different life circumstance, different psychology. So even when we repeat the same protocol, it is interacting with so many other variables. So we have to be able to quantify that non-protocol specific variance and use it within participant design. So what you're actually asking someone to do is basically do a study twice, right? So logistically, this is almost completely infeasible as a way of trying to investigate the response that people have on an individual basis. So it ends up that we kind of need to use research to give us these broad ideas. And then a lot of the individualization is going to have to come through the practice of coaching and accepting the limitations of that. So to answer your question, I think we can lean on our anecdotes, certainly, and just say, yeah, some people respond better to training. I think that is a self-evident truth. Now, being able to predict that, I don't think we have the capacity to do. And even speaking back to our sex differences, think about it from this perspective. If some of the things that we often associate with individual responsiveness, like I bet if we looked at baseline testosterone levels, we'd see the dudes who are walking around with just damn near like endogenous levels of what some other people would need to be on TRT, quote unquote, to get to like a low dose steroid cycle, they're going to be more responsive to training. Actually, we don't see that. If we did, we would not observe these really similar relative increases between men and women because men have much higher baseline levels of testosterone. I think a better way of viewing testosterone is that it kind of sets your baseline, at least within normal ranges. So when someone is within typical physiological ranges of testosterone, if we were just to do a cross-sectional study, I pull 1,000 people off the street, men, And we break them into those quartiles again. And we're looking at people with testosterone levels. We would anticipate small differences in baseline level of lean body mass and muscularity. We're talking to the tune of maybe 4 or 5 pounds, 6 pounds, 2, 3 kilos, if we're to compare the highest and the lowest. But then we put all of those folks in a resistance training protocol. That does not predict how well they respond to the resistance training protocol, which squares with what we see in terms of sex differences. So essentially, there are some people who start with a higher level of baseline and seem to do very well when they start resistance training. There are some people who start with a low baseline and seem to respond very well to resistance training. And there are people with a high baseline who don't respond very well and who do. So all of those things are interacting, and it's very difficult to tease that out in the real world, but it is relatively apparent when you look at the research. So what is the maximum muscularity that can be achieved? It's almost a question that is intriguing. And probably the best way to look at that is, what are the top level, drug-free bodybuilders out there? And unless you're entirely cynical, you could assume they're all cheating. Or maybe you could take a more realistic view, in my opinion, that the majority are probably not. And then if you were interested in, like, what does a true non-responder look like, you'd probably want to talk to a personal trainer who is, does a pretty good job of tracking data, and be like, all right, so what are some of the persistent, like, worst outcomes you've seen with clients who you feel like they're doing at least enough right to make some progress, and they just make small changes. Now, I've definitely seen that, where you really put somebody through, like, the good protocol, and you can tell they're gaining weight, they're training with you, so they're at least in an energy surplus, and they are at least training hard. And unless they're somehow doing like protein restriction, outside of the gym, and you don't think they are, because they're showing you their meals, you're interacting with them in their life. You can be sometimes unfortunately surprised by how little muscle they put on. But I have yet to see someone who doesn't put on any muscle, and not even in the research has it been observed that people don't gain strength, at least on average. They're almost always performance responders, even when you can see an observation where someone, did not gain muscle during a 12 or 24-week period. It's very rare when you do a resistance training protocol and someone doesn't get stronger in untrained participants. It does often happen in trained participants, and that might be because they've already adapted to that stimulus or something close enough to it, or that there was actually a less specific stimulus for the outcome you were measuring than afterwards. You could imagine if you were to take a competitive powerlifter who's only been training a year, so he meets the criteria for recreationally trained, perhaps, but has been doing a lot of squat, bench, deadlift, and you take someone else who's just recreationally trained, but has never done a squat, bench, deadlift, and they both start a protocol where they have squat and they have bench, but it's always like 10 reps, and it's only, once a week, and the powerlifter was doing that 3 times per week each, and with, doubles and singles, where the powerlifter actually gets weaker or maintains strength, and the recreationally trained non-powerlifter increases strength. And they would show up quite differently in that data set, but it would be the context which would explain it.
Right. I'm going to circle back to one note about sex differences. What about the difference in, let's say, relative shoulder width, upper body musculature starting for women versus men, and lower body musculature? Is that relevant to how men and women put on muscle mass?
It might be. There's I have research-based thoughts on this, and then I have observational thoughts based upon my experience in the field. The research does demonstrate that the disparity between muscularity in men and women is more noticeable in terms of skeletal muscle mass and strength in the upper body versus lower body. Now, you will get different views in the discussions if you read this and if you talk to researchers as to whether or not this has sociocultural influences, true sex-based physiological differences, or some combination of the two. And I don't think we have enough data to firmly fall into either 3 of those. The safe bet is, of course, is always both, right? But I will tell you this. The IPF is the most dominant federation that's having a lot of participation. It's drug tested for powerlifting. And a really interesting phenomenon that you're seeing is that I think the gap between squat and deadlift strength is closing a little faster than bench press strength between men and women. Um, and don't get me wrong, there are women who are benching in the 160 kilo range raw when we're talking about like the 84 plus category, the biggest women, right? And there are also on the other end of the bell curve some really, really impressive lightweight benchers. You know, you have someone like Agata Sitko who, you know, is competing in the 69 kilo class, but very light, like actually water cut to almost 63 and can bench 150 kilos. Or the classic example of a Jen Thompson, who competes around 132 pounds, but is benched over 315. And that's a very impressive bench press, even for a male of a similar body weight. That's like 4 standard deviations over the mean, though, however, so she's certainly an outlier. But that's becoming more common. You can find multiple middleweight and light middle kind of body weight female competitors who are raw drug-free benching in the low 300 pounds or in the 130 to 150 kilo range now. And that's incredible. But some of it is related to the movement specifications of the sport. And one of the ways that, here's the deal. It's like this is changing a little bit as they've changed the requirements for what is a legal bench. You have to hit a certain degree of elbow depth. But bench press, the rules require you to only keep contact of your upper shoulder, your glutes on the bench, and your head. Meaning that if you can arch your back a lot and lift your chest higher, you can reduce the range of motion based upon being more flexible. And one thing that is well established, not only in the general population, but also powerlifters, is that women generally have more joint range of motion. And that probably is a true physiological difference. So flexibility tends to be higher in women than men on average. There's, of course, always individual differences that can span more than that average difference between sexes, within sex. But I think that is also playing into it. So when I think about, all right, how would we truly use the in the trenches data to corroborate this, is I want to look at that 120 plus class where generally the bigger bodies are not quite as flexible. And generally we're probably looking at just people who are trying to get as strong as they possibly can because they're power lifters, and they're doing so by just enhancing their muscularity. And we're seeing the 84 plus kilo women who are often in like the 100 to 120 kilo range. So we're talking 220 to 270-ish pounds for most competitors. They're benching in the mid 300s, like 350, 360, 370. We haven't yet seen, you know, a 400 pound bench out of someone at that level. So if you think about the relative amount of skeletal muscle mass, an 84 plus kilo woman who's let's say 110 or 120 kilos, they're probably comparable to someone who's like a 93 in the men's class. And there's a pretty big disparity between the top level benchers and the 93 and the 84 plus. You know, Jonathan Keiko, he's an outlier, but he's putting up 250. And a quote unquote good bencher is putting up 200. And a deadlift specialist is putting up, you know, with really long arms, so they're not as good at bench, is putting up 180 or 170 at the highest level in the 93s. So that gap is more than 15%, 10, 20, 15%. And that is a bit less than you see in the squat, where we got Sunita Moa, who's now squatted 700 pounds. You know, she squatted 318. We've got Natalie Lalai, who's deadlifted over 300 kilos. And those numbers are just slightly more depressed or disassociated from the numbers that you kind of see with a similar level of skeletal muscle mass. And another thing I would point out, and this is also a bit contaminated by flexibility, is that when you correct for skeletal muscle mass, when you compare Olympic weightlifters, you see like 90 to 92% of the numbers in men and women versus men. So that gap is narrower. It's a little more of a developed sport, but it's also heavily influenced by, you know, your flexibility. So if you can get to a deeper position, then you don't have to lift the bar as high. But it is more about your lower body strength. And that might be why you see only kind of like a 10% gap there. So to answer your question, I think there is a physiological difference, something that is impacting men versus women, to where the distribution of the muscle mass, even though it may be similar in aggregate, it tends to be a little more upper body dominant. But I think that also interacts with the fact that your typical male is benching when they start lifting weights is the first thing they do. And the typical woman, and of course there are always exceptions, and I don't have any judgment about this. This is just an observation. The typical woman starts doing lower body training when they first get into the gym. And the typical sport participation, it is, similar and more similar over time. But if I had to roll the dice and say, I've got a new male athlete and a new female athlete, if you had to just guess what sport are they doing, I'd say, all right, for the woman, I'm going to guess soccer or basketball or volleyball. If it's a team sport and they're in the U.S. For the guy, I'm going to think it's probably going to be maybe softball. For the guy, I'm going to guess football, basketball, or maybe baseball, right? And there's much more S&C embedded in that later cohort. So, and the sports themselves have more upper body involvement, especially say American football. So it's very difficult to say, whether someone's background, the social cultural environment, or the physiology is coming into play here. But the reality is there does seem to be a disparity. It's not huge, but it is notable, and the cause is elusive.
Embedded in that is people tend to self-select the things they're better at. Okay, I like using the example of yoga. I mean, you go to an average yoga class, there's more women than men. So does yoga make people more flexible? Absolutely. I think that's comfortably stated. But at the same time, do more flexible people self-select to do yoga because they're already going to be good at it? So there's probably both dynamics at play. Bit of a
100%.
shift here. So social media is fun, and it's become a battleground for hypertrophy influencers acting like they know more than PhDs, the researchers in the muscle building community. I talked with Brad Schoenfeld recently a little bit about this. Why do you think this dynamic has developed?
I think there's a lot of things that go into this. And I can speak to some of the things that probably contribute to it. Some come from within the bodybuilding community and some come from without. I think, not directly within. So if we go all the way back to the anabolic steroid moral panic that occurred in the 90s, where you got Mark McGuire and you've got Barry Bonds, the generation later.
The WWE, it came out
correct.
that the
Vince
wrestlers
McMahon,
were gassed up. Yep.
Yep, and Vince McMahon is, saying we're going to clean up wrestling, all that. There was these series of moral panics and congressional hearings, especially in the U.S., and the landmark decision to make in the U.S. it a class 3 controlled substance, to the same degree that methamphetamines, cocaine are classified, and a criminal offense to own, which is different than other places. Like in the UK, you can personally have them and use them without it being criminalized. I think that created an interesting dynamic where bodybuilders in the strength training community which does consist of a lot of people who are recreationally using anabolic steroids, became feeling like they're outsiders and that they were now having that decision moralized, which wasn't really the case. This is before my time. I was born in '83, so I didn't even really think about this stuff until it kind of been embedded in our culture. But the understanding I have, especially knowing that you could basically go to a doctor in the 80s and 70s and 60s and say, hey, I'm a competitive bodybuilder. I wonder if can I safely take anabolic steroids? And certain doctors would be like, yeah. And they'd be more open to they didn't even have the term for it then, but a harm reduction model, right? And there wasn't an overblown exaggeration of the side effects of, non-polypharmacy, single-use anabolic steroids. Obviously, this changed. If you start from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s, now we're getting into polypharmacy, and it's absolutely not just, baldness and acne that you're potentially dealing with. But the point being is that it became much more of a moral question at this point. And you will actually, if you look at qualitative interviews with bodybuilders using anabolic steroids that came out in the 90s, they express that they have lost trust with not only the medical community, but also the scientific community. And that's for two reasons. One is they actually reported experiences of being judged and denied service, or not really having the opportunity to feel like they could even share what they're doing with their doctor because of, shame. So the stigma of being someone who's using anabolic steroids. So they stopped interfacing with their doctors and they looked with. Another thing was that sports scientists were pretty late to the party with acknowledging the effects on performance of anabolic steroids. And you even had papers into the 90s saying, we're not sure this does anything. And every athlete is like, okay, we're going to keep doing it because it clearly does. Now it's well established in the medical community and the scientific community that harm reduction is probably a better approach in almost all situations, whether you're dealing with true drug abuse or just people who are unwilling to make the certain behavior changes that would be ideal, but they're not going to for whatever reason. And we're going to focus on, okay, what can they do? And it's just good psychology, to be honest. So not only has that changed, but it came with decades of stigma, but also that naturally the scientific community is going to be limited in their ability to observe and especially experimentally test something that has become a controlled 3 substance. There's no NIH funding for running, dangerous levels of anabolic steroids and polypharmacy because you can't get an ethics approval. So a lot of the research we have on anabolic steroids kind of stopped at that point, and it was mostly on hypogonadal, men and actual clinical uses. So that's one big component of it is you kind of have bodybuilders who tend to be kind of leaders in the muscle building space who have the cultural artifact of being distrustful of science and distrustful of the medical community. The other thing that's much more modern is the kind of what we've seen of the death of the expert and the distrust of the authoritative bodies in this space for nutrition and health. And that comes from a combination of COVID, political changes, and the rapid growth of social media, science communication, and knowing that controversy sells. The statement "doctors hate him" there's so much there. It's funny, but for one, it positions doctors as not people who are just here to try to help you, but they are trying to get you in their office to manipulate you. They're extracting something from the economy. They can't be trusted as actors who are purely here for beneficial reasons for society or even for you. They hate it when good things come out that aren't within their purview that can help people, which of course couldn't be further from the truth. We have ACSM pushing exercise as medicine. We have the preference of doctors to use lifestyle interventions whenever possible. And it's generally just not the same thing. And links between collusion of the medical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, they exist, but they've been kind of blown up to something that is probably not representative, at least on the individual level, of what's truly happening. And there's this misunderstanding of also like, how does the FDA or the UK systems work for actually developing dietary guidelines? There's this perception that they happen in these back shady rooms with corporate influence, but in reality, what they're doing is they're getting volunteer top-tier researchers from the nutrition field who are in open meetings that you can go to and watch on Zoom with community involvement, and they're forced to only use specific systematic reviews, and they can only meet one another to write these guidelines in a very specific criteria setting, and they have to disclose conflicts of interest. And I think if people actually understood what went into the dietary recommendations for Americans, for example, they'd be like, oh wow, that's far more transparent than I ever thought it would be, and very unlikely to have some of these influences, and it's based on very high quality data with the best researchers. So there's this disconnect because of some of those cultural things. And then
not to mention the fact that the average overweight, obese North American definitely wasn't eating anything that resembled the dietary guidelines in the first place.
And exactly, that's another extrapolation from it. It's not only, so it's either it's some flavor of these guidelines are created to keep us unhealthy so that they can keep us on the hook and making us pay for drugs or treatment that we don't actually need. And there's this medical, scientific, government, industry, multinational conglomerate conspiracy to keep us unwell, to take our money, or to make us a slave society, whatever your pick is, or something far less sinister of they're just incompetent, or they're stuck in their ways, but they're not as agile and they're not paying attention to the best data. Both are not true, and sometimes people will actually have both beliefs, which, if you really think about it, they directly contradict one another. Either you're a competent conspiratorial multinational shadow group that can manipulate things going all the way back to Ansel Keys, or you're an incompetent group who can't actually put together an infographic with fruit properly. Like I don't, those they can't both be true. But that's what bias does. It enables us to hold contradictory beliefs so long as we can be anti something or pro something. So anyway, there's that. But you're 100% right. Even if that was true, 80% of Americans don't follow the activity or the nutrition guidelines that have come from them. So we can't even lay any blame at the feet of these guidelines that no one follows because no one follows them. Now, that's a whole other aside. Why is there this tension within the bodybuilding community? Because that applies more broadly to the wellness and the very, very specific kind of like enhanced bodybuilding scene. And as we know, fitness and muscle building is much bigger than that now. I think a large part of that is cultural differences, values, and ego. And it comes down to miscommunication, misperceptions, and a poor understanding of what science is for. The straw man of the typical muscle building researcher is a pencil neck who doesn't know anything about lifting is false in my experience about 9 out of 10 cases. There's very few people who dedicate their entire lives to studying research, specifically on muscle building, not just a general exercise scientist, but a resistance training researcher who they themselves don't lift. And that wasn't what got them into it. They're just curious lifters in most cases with a certain level of academic acumen. That's what I am. Right. I just really wanted to take my career as far as I could. And I was very curious and I tend to be analytical and I like thinking. So, but I'm a actively competing bodybuilder and I would identify as that first rather than a sports science researcher, even though I am both. The other thing though, is I think the intentions of the scientific community are sometimes misunderstood. And there's definitely blame to lay at the feet of the scientific community and how they communicate and how well they communicate their own purpose. Because I think it needs to be said that bodybuilders have never needed sports scientists to be big. And that's just the reality, right? We saw, sports performance existed before sports science. Do I think sports science could perhaps enhance the rate of progress, make things safer, more efficient? Well, you don't have to ask me. Just look at the professional sports team and how much money they invest into sports science. And we're talking about $1 billion industry. If you knew how many high-speed cameras were in every MLB stadium, if you knew the budget that was blown on nutritionists, and if you knew the budget that was blown on sports medicine doctors, and the reality is that, yeah, high-performance sport, whether it's the Team GB cycling team, or whether it's swimmers, or whether it's baseball players, or whether it's strength and conditioning, or whether it's nutritionists, sports dietetics, anytime performance becomes something where there can be an edge to be had, people are going to find a way to get it. And it's very capitalist in nature. You just wouldn't see sports science embedded in sports if it wasn't doing something. And the more money that comes into a given sport, the more you see that occur. The current professionalization of powerlifting, I think, is a great example of that, where your top level athletes now can get paid to lift, depending upon what country they're from and how good they are. And they typically have a powerlifting specific physiotherapist, a powerlifting specific nutritionist, a powerlifting specific coach. And many times, these are people with bachelor's, master's, or even PhDs in a given field. And you may have all of them. They're not always, but most of the time, they're at least heavily scientifically informed. And it's a non-negligible number of IPF world champions who you might see with a velocity tracker on their barbell, or with somebody with an RD or other letters after their name who they're paying to help them do this, who aren't using scientifically validated metrics like the RIR-based RPE scale, or using things like water loading and water cutting that have been researched, even before it was researched, but nonetheless, they are updating their practices quite consistently based upon data. Powerlifting is very data-driven. Now, that's not happening to the same degree in bodybuilding, and that's because bodybuilding doesn't have the same money coming into it. But when you look specifically at kind of the drug-free bodybuilding world, it's actually heavily related and heavily influenced and populated by sports scientists. And you can make an argument that the enhanced world is heavily influenced by science, but pharmacology, although it has been more of an in-house underground thing. And even that is changing. There's a lot of voices now who are trying to take a more quote unquote evidence-based perspective and using a harm reduction model while still having the goal of high performance. So I think it's a changing space, but the tension is for all of those reasons. And I think what needs to be understood is that what occurs in practice, from my perspective as a I would hope to say, a modern, forward-thinking sports scientist, is I want to investigate what athletes are doing, because success leaves clues. Something about anecdotes that I think is quite interesting is that the collection of things that a bodybuilder does to be successful, we know has resulted in their success. Some of those things are critical. Some of those things have no impact on what they're doing. Some of those things might take away from it. What we can say for sure is that none of the things they're doing are sufficient to prevent their success. Now, that's the limitation of an anecdote. And we can start to observe that in more controlled settings, or maybe even manipulate things in fully controlled settings. We can start to tease out cause and effect, and then we can feed that back to the lifters, and they can try it out in the field, and we can get closer and closer to enhancing performance, or enhancing performance while having a little less harm. And I think the unfortunate thing is that the work that sports scientists and sports nutritionists do in a space like this, once something becomes accepted, then it becomes, we've always done this and we've always known it, and we preferentially look at the athletes who kind of were ahead of the curve per se, and we kind of go, this is common knowledge. Like an example is there's a clip from Ronnie Coleman's Unbelievable where he's doing shoulder presses, and he's just going from shoulder to nose, and he's basically doing length and partials on a shoulder press. And like, this isn't anything new, but for every Ronnie Coleman, there was someone else who was kind of focusing on the pump and the squeeze. And so it's challenging to kind of make this stick. And now also that we're like, if it fits your macros, tracking macros is fully embedded in bodybuilding now, enhanced and natural, which is interesting. And people don't remember that, like, oh, yeah, of course bodybuilders track calories, always have. Absolutely not. There was the standard 12-week diet where you would just cut out food groups and not be aware of even what your calorie intake was, and just know that you're eating a high protein diet, and these are the bad foods, these are the good foods. And I was like, knock down, drag out battles only 15 years ago that now people have totally forgotten. And that was something that was generated actually in the research. You can even find the echoes in the 90s where people observing bodybuilders' diets are even suggesting in the discussion, like quite literally, like, we tracked these bodybuilders' diets, they did this, this, and this. We found that they were heavily restrictive in their food choices. We saw some micronutrient deficiencies. We would recommend that they maybe use an exchange system so that they could have higher variety of foods and be less likely to have these micronutrient deficiencies while still meeting their energy targets and losing weight over time. They were describing
That's a fancy way to say macros.
Exactly. So I think that is the ideal relationship, where we take what's being done, we figure out which one of those three buckets it falls into, and we go back and we refine it. We talk to the coaches, we talk to the athletes, and we say, what do you think? They come back to us and go, this did or didn't work. And then we do research. And that is a bit of a paradigm shift in sports science, but it is actually the way all research is going. Doing mixed methods where you do qualitative interviews and then going out in the field, doing surveys, trying things out, doing case studies, case series, and doing true embedded sports science where the participants are influencing the research designs and the questions being asked, and making sure that the hypotheses you generate and the questions you ask are not just informed by prior literature, but also what's being done in practice if you're actually doing sports science. Now, if you're doing mechanistic, how do I understand the nature of physiology? That's a bit of a different game. But for me, as someone who is studying physique and strength sports science, which is what I describe myself as, that is an integral part of the process if I want to be effective for the community I'm trying to serve. So I always get frustrated when I get pigeonholed as either by the hardcore scientific community as like, oh, that guy's just kind of a bodybuilder with a fake lab coat on, or this guy doesn't know anything about, like the real in the trenches stuff, like Eric Helms and his pencil neck bullshit. Like, he's never tried X, Y, and Z. I'm like, dude, I was a bodybuilder before I had a PhD. So I think that dichotomy is definitely a false one. And there's very few people who are really embedded in the community who would believe it is that simple. And it almost is always like, no, it's someone else. You know, it's the TikTokers who go say evidence-based but don't really understand what it means, or it's the people communicating the science when you really drill it down. But a lot of the times it's just this emotional reaction to like feeling like someone's saying that, hey, we observed X, Y, and Z is almost a vindication or an attack on their own observed experiences of what seems to work well. It's very difficult to share data on the relationship between higher volumes and hypertrophy with someone who has had great experience with a low volume, high intensity protocol without them feeling like they're doing something wrong. And not all scientists are good science communicators, and they tend to be more mathematical, analytical, black and white thinkers, and not necessarily always having a good bedside manner. They're not necessarily practitioners and researchers. So they can come across brusque and judgmental, even sometimes because they are, but other times when they don't intend it. And something that I often come across is I'll report the findings, and people immediately assume that I'm making a suggestion, a recommendation, or I'm interpreting the data. And if they actually read my interpretation or they hear my recommendations, they're far more nuanced. And sometimes they're quite divorced from what would be quote unquote optimal in this 12-week study, because unless you're only going to be training for 12 weeks, that's not necessarily the best way to go, because we're trying to now go, okay, when what do we do with this in the real world? And when we're not in controlled conditions, when we try to take this from being translational research to actually being translated to practice. So I know that's a very long answer to your question, but that's why.
Well, I think anybody who's been, along for the ride on this one is going to take a lot of nuance. And this is a very unique conversation that definitely has not arisen here. And, I've had a couple of recent episodes, again, one with Brad Schoenfeld about the arguments over volume. And you alluded to some of that. You get the Mike Mentzer camp versus the classical, old school, high volume bodybuilding stuff. There's one thing I thought of, it's more just an observation. There's a lot of stuff that's been validated, but then we are comfortable discarding things like Arnold and Joe Weider and that camp very loudly waved around the muscle confusion principle. And guess what? That's largely rubbish. So we don't even hear about that anymore. Like, it's almost like even the bros, outside of maybe the craziest people, have completely discarded that as just archaic myth. All right. Let's see this. Are there important differences, you alluded to this, between drug-free lifters and natural lifters, specifically capacity to recover?
Probably. I think, essentially anabolic steroids increase the rate of protein turnover, leaning towards protein synthesis. And there are some drugs in the broader class of PEDs, not necessarily just anabolic steroids, which seem to increase the rate of healing. So recovery is a bit of a nebulous term. In sports science, it just simply means getting your performance back to baseline and being able to then train again. So I am actually not convinced that the main benefit in bodybuilders specifically, of taking PEDs is that you can train more again and harder. I think it's that there is that dose response relationship. I mentioned earlier, it might only be 3 kilos if you're comparing, 7 pounds, the highest and the lowest quartile of endogenous levels of testosterone. But we have to remember the type of doses we're talking about here. Like, exogenous levels of testosterone can make the gap between your average male and woman look smaller than the average natural and an average enhanced guy when you actually think about the relative dose polypharmacy area under the curve. So the main difference between an enhanced bodybuilder and a natural bodybuilder is that once you go on a very, very large dose of androgens, you're just elevating your baseline. And that's still happening while you're training. So it's difficult to know whether someone is growing because they're taking anabolic steroids and not much else, or they're growing because they're taking anabolic steroids and training effectively. And there is some impact, I'm sure, of enhanced recovery capacity, but I think it's probably smaller than just the sheer fact that if you take a bunch of anabolic steroids, you will grow regardless. You don't have to be lifting weights to go through puberty, I think is a great way to think of this, right? You get exposed to the very large rise in testosterone as a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old boy. And by the time you're 18, 19, 20, you're going to look very different. You're going to have a lot more skeletal muscle mass. And that is also true if you jack up your endogenous levels of testosterone through exogenous anabolic steroids 10, 20-fold. You're going to get a second growth spurt. And then when you go off it, you will shrink. So I think that contaminates so much of the whole advanced recovery that you might get from it. And it's probably a larger effect. Now, when we're talking about other sports, where many times they are taking much, much, much lower doses at much, much, much lower frequencies because they are attempting, and those who do this, and I don't think it's necessarily as widespread as some conspiracy theorists would want to believe on the internet, they're trying to evade drug testing protocols, right? I think that probably plays a bigger role. We're going through a really hard training block. We think we can get away with this. This is maybe not as easy to test unless, they come a knocking with a random test. We can get a good 12-week span of training here because I'm on a little something, something. But I think many times it is just a little something, something. We're not talking about I'm on a 24/7 blast cruise cycle. I'm taking 10 to 15 years off my life, and I'm okay with that because I'm trying to win an Olympia. And those are two very different environments. And I think sometimes there's actually a decrease in the ability to recover based upon the polypharmacy that someone's experiencing, the androgenic side effects. You can get weird swings in mood, big variations in your mental state. And if you talk to people who are very candid, who are on high dose polypharmacy PED use for the purposes of bodybuilding, it can be much more like a roller coaster ride than it is just I feel superhuman all the time. That's there. There are times when they do feel that way, but sometimes they feel achy joints, they feel too dry. Other times they feel bloated. Their mood state changes. Sometimes they feel like lifting heavy is too dangerous. And many times they're taking a lot of drugs. They respond very well, and they can get away with just kind of wiggling the muscle a little bit, and it'll grow in a synergistic fashion with the drugs. Other times you get people who are trying to take as little as possible and really drive their training a bit more. For every rest in peace, John Meadows, who's out there talking about how to use only the amount of drugs you need and, doing a safe use approach and letting training drive the adaptation and drugs support the kind of the recovery environment. You've got people who are running quite literally $2,000 to $3,000 of anabolic steroids and other performance enhancing drugs per month while they're competing. So I think it's a mixed bag.
I think of Boston Lloyd. He's kind of a famous influencer type, bad outcome there. I don't know much about them, but I keep hearing about the Trend twins. I don't keep up too hard on the influencers in this space, but not necessarily good things. Even Sam Sulek, there's, a fair bit of implication that, fair bit of usage for a particularly young guy. Are there any things, it doesn't have to be even drug related. If anything, it's probably not the drug related stuff in terms of training protocols, nutrition that comes out of the non-tested bodybuilding world that you actually think might be quite unhelpful or misleading for the everyday person, natural lifter, who still gets exposed to some of this stuff via social media.
Yeah, I think many of the principles that have been discarded were kind of peppered over by drugs. I mean, the original high intensity camp, it came out of, a quote unquote experiment that was actually a detrained bodybuilder, Casey Viator, taking a whole bunch of drugs and doing a low volume protocol and regaining lost muscle and more. And that was very poorly promoted or very poorly tracked, not actually a published study, and was basically pumped up as a way to sell HIIT and Nautilus equipment, so if we look at the historical context of this, it's always been there. And like isometrics came out around the same time as anabolic steroids, and those were promoted heavily. And it was probably the effects of anabolic steroids. There's a really good Iron Game history publication on that. I think the general idea of kind of pump and squeeze is something that chasing the pump, chasing high volume, but not necessarily with the requisite proximity to failure or progressive overload embedded, does come directly from that. That if you are training consistently, but not necessarily with any kind of organizational principle or mind towards progression, you can kind of just keep making gains, and you'll end up progressing because you're growing a lot of muscle, and there's a certain point where the weights just get silly. light, and it doesn't feel like you're doing anything. But yeah, I think I don't want to make it sound like I think bodybuilders who are not on drugs need to be powerlifters. They don't. But progressive overload is still an embedded principle, and you just simply won't see natural athletes who are making progress who you're not seeing progressive overload in one way or another. You have to be savvy enough to see it. If you just literally think it's okay if your load's going up, then maybe not. But if you see an older lifter whose loads are still reasonably high, but they're controlling the eccentric more, they're pausing, they're using a different range of motion, they're managing to find a way to use similar or lower loads, but still expose the muscle at its most basic level to higher degrees or similar degrees of tension. And you don't necessarily always see that, at least in any kind of intentional manner, in all of the enhanced strengths. You certainly do in some, don't get me wrong. But I think that is the big one. And that is probably something that I think doesn't hold back people quite as much anymore. But it does just muddy the waters. But you can also make the argument that if someone is maintaining a relatively static drug protocol and they change something in their training and they see a difference, maybe it's happening at a greater magnitude. If there is a synergistic effect between the drugs and the training to where you'd be able to observe it. I'm not sure about that. If it is truly more so kind of raising your baseline muscularity rather than having a synergistic effect, we just don't know enough about the way the drugs operate. Then maybe not. I don't know if training is additive or synergistic with drugs. And I think that is something that I would be quite curious about. I think that's probably both to some degree. So, yeah, I think I'm open to the possibility that because you're seeing larger magnitudes of change in the enhanced ranks, if things are reasonably well controlled, that it might give us insights similarly to studies on untrained individuals, which we love to poo-poo, right? But here's the reality is if we want to look at the difference between full range of motion training and lengthened partials, both are going to be pretty effective. Both train you in the most effective range. And we're interested in, oh, no, I only want to see this in highly trained lifters. Like, okay, so this highly trained lifter, best case scenario is going to gain 3 pounds, in this 24-week study. Okay. And now you're telling me that we're comparing two good protocols and we're trying to differentiate between, good and better. So what's the difference? Half a pound? So they're going to gain 2.5 pounds here and 3 pounds in that one. Can we even detect that? And the reality is that probably not in most cases. We need multiple studies, and we won't know until we have a meta-analysis because of sampling error, sampling variance, just the amount of variability that you'll see in response, low sample sizes, measurement error, and our inability to detect a true change. We're going to see if there's a true small effect on a given outcome, 90% of studies showing a null, and probably 10% showing some type of positive effect that's probably over-exaggerating the true effect, and then maybe an errant negative finding that probably isn't significant, but would make you think, oh, maybe this isn't that good. And you can't know until you've got at least a handful of studies, if not 10, 20 in a well-done meta-analysis, if you want to compare things that are in the margins, which is kind of sucky. But it just tells you, okay, what are the limitations and what should we be using science for? And it's to tell us general directional relationships. And it also tells you, hey, maybe this studies on untrained individuals who can grow 5 times as fast in an 8 or 12-week period aren't that bad. Because am I fundamentally different from an untrained person as a trained person? Or am I just growing slower? And I think in most cases, it is actually more the latter. And I've become much more open to extrapolating to trained lifters from studies on untrained lifters in many cases, because I haven't seen persistent qualitative differences in how they respond to training. They are more quantitative. You're seeing this logarithmic slowing of the rate of gains in trained lifters, not this completely different way of responding to training itself. You may require a higher threshold of stimulus to get something. It's kind of, think of it this way. If you take that same example I gave before, you take a power lifter versus a recreational lifter, you expose them to squats and deadlifts, but it's less than they've done. They might get weaker while the other one gets stronger. You see this in cyclists. You take older individuals who are out of shape, sedentary, and you give them a 2 to 3 times per week running protocol or cycling protocol. You give that same thing to marathon runners or elite cyclists, and their VO2 max will go down while the VO2 max will go up in the former case. So I think that as your ceiling, sorry, as your floor rises, you're going to need to have some type of stimulus that is at least sufficient to maintain that and a little more, which doesn't necessarily need to be huge, but at a certain point it does. You know, you just simply can't maintain Tour de France levels of physiological adaptation by doing the typical endurance training study out there. Just like you probably can't maintain, you know, WNBF pro like levels of gains by doing your twice a week, you know, intervention for health that includes resistance training.
Do a little frame on one of the things you said in there, and this is how I like to think about it. Whether we can quantify just how much of a genetic ceiling someone has, there is a theoretical genetic ceiling and mechanisms that prevent us from getting absurdly muscular. Oh, go ahead.
Andrew, can I modify that just slightly?
Sure, please.
I would say, and this is important because a ceiling kind of implies this hard stop that you abruptly hit and you bump your head. I would say it's an asymptote, and an asymptote sounds like I'm being pedantic, but it's essentially a mathematical concept where the closer you get to it, the more you eventually never reach it. It's like this sloping line. So the experience of reaching your practical limit in terms of muscularity to where you're growing so slow that you essentially feel like the snail's pace is not observable. The only thing that actually creates that true limit mathematically is probably the opposite pressure of sarcopenia. So you're getting to a point, probably if you're healthy, that's actually you're in your 60s, maybe late 50s at the earliest, where there are physiological mechanisms that are actually driving atrophy while you're trying to drive hypertrophy. But if you started training at 18, you're probably still making gains in your 40s if you manage to still keep it progressive, which is a hard thing to do. Most people just don't have the will, desire, or even see the point to it when they're scraping and crawling to get 1 pound over the next 8 years. So, but the reason why I don't like to use the terminology ceiling is because people think when they hit a plateau, I've hit it. Because a ceiling makes you think, oh shit, like I stood up too fast, right? If you're in a plateau, that is very different. Like if you hit an abrupt plateau, you're by definition not at your genetic ceiling. Because if you're truly approaching your ceiling and you're doing everything right, it should just feel like this, you're walking through, you know, mud, and the mud just keeps getting higher. And God damn it, now it's up to chest height, and you can walk slower and slower and slower, but you're still moving forward. Not, I'm walking through mud, and then I hit a wall, and I didn't realize it. This is actually, you know, like blocking my egress. So I just think that's a really important point to make, is that it is slowed progress to the point where you reach a practical limit. But if you can find a way, there are still very marginal gains to be made.
And that's absolutely the key takeaway, is the diminishing returns the further that you get away from, you know, maybe your starting point is a real key. And that's how I frame it. So that way, if you look at the research on trained individuals, they are by definition further away from their starting point, and therefore we're going to see diminishing returns, which is really just restating something that you've said in depth on this episode. Is there anything on the nutrition side that maybe came out of the bodybuilding world? The first thing that comes to mind is probably the more aggressive bulk and cut cycles. If I understand the research now, calorie surpluses past a certain point seem to overwhelmingly disproportionately gain body fat versus enhance muscle growth. Maybe more on that, or anything else that you've seen on the nutrition side. You're like, hey, it's time to put this one to rest. I want people to stop doing this.
Yeah, let's directly integrate that with the concept we have here of the idea of diminishing returns. So when a novice does everything right, they might experience those type of gains that I talked about. And there's a great study that I think represents this by Rosnick and colleagues. And there's a study on untrained university-aged males who were put into one of three groups. Either keep following your habitual diet, and we're going to start you on a 3-day-per-week hypertrophy training program, or we're going to give you one of two weight gainer shakes. That every day you're going to consume 2,000 calories, either entirely consisting of maltodextrin or consisting of about 20% whey protein with maltodextrin. And importantly, of course, this isn't a metabolic ward study, not a controlled feeding trial. They're asking them to follow their habitual diet and then giving them this weight gainer. They're probably in those weight gainer groups not able to sustain the same caloric intake they were having to maintain weight, but definitely it's pushing them into a surplus. And what you observe is about 3 kilos on average of lean mass gains and body weight gains over 8 weeks in the two groups with the weight gainer. Didn't matter that it was just maltodextrin, just a sugar shake, or that it had a bit of protein in it. So that means that on average, pure lean body mass gains almost a pound a week, 6.6 pounds over 8 weeks. Crazy. That's awesome, right? But the really intriguing part of this study is not just that it didn't matter that it was sugar or whey protein and sugar, and that hell, you just need to feed these guys and they're going to grow like a weed because it's their first 8 weeks of training. It's the control group. The control group was not in a surplus, even though they gained net weight. And I'll explain how, why, and why that matters. So they lost about, if I recall correctly, 0.5 kilogram or 1 kilogram of fat mass. I think it was 1 kilo of fat mass, but they gained 1.5 kilos of fat-free mass. So scale weight went up about 1 pound. So you'd think, oh, they were just in a small surplus. But the energy density of fat is about, adipose tissue, is about 5 times that of lean mass. So what that really means is that these guys are on a slight deficit, about 100 calories per day on average. And this makes sense. You ask them to clamp their habitual diet and you increase their activity, right? So, of course. So what happened is they held back their growth potential. Instead of gaining 3 kilos of fat-free mass on average, they gained 1.5. So 50% of the gains they could have made because they were in a slight deficit. Now, some people will be like, I'm fine with that if I also lose, 1 kilogram of fat mass. Other people would be like, well, I'd prefer to not gain any fat and gain 3 kilos of muscle. My body fat percentage will actually be even better in that scenario, right? And you would probably look better. But I think that's just a really powerful reminder of how strong your initial adaptation to resistance training can be, that your body will find a way. You can be in a 100-calorie deficit. Your body will pull from endogenous fat stores and still build what it can because you're giving it an adaptive stimulus and it's a survival machine. But if you feed it sufficiently, it can grow even more. And we didn't have a group that got a 3,000-calorie weight gainer. Maybe they would have gained fat. Maybe not. I don't know. But that matches our observations in the real world. But that's beginners. And we've seen it replicated multiple times. We did it in our lab. Also, Garta and colleagues did it in the 20-teens up in Norway. They took advanced athletes, and we took really reasonably well-trained cohorts of men and women and tried to feed them faster or slower, or you could say it this way, higher or lower calorie surpluses. And you see that almost is perfectly explained by fat mass gain. And that's because when you're an Olympic level athlete or you've been lifting for 5 or 6 years on average, you can't gain, no matter what you do without short of anabolic steroids, 3 kilograms in 8 weeks of fat-free mass. It will not happen. So the best case scenario is maybe a quarter of that on average, something like that. So what is your body going to do with that surplus? The only thing it can. It's going to put more fat mass, right? So essentially, the utility of bulking from a physiological perspective becomes decreasingly less useful as you slow your own rate of potential. And you really just need to match your potential rate of growth. And the way I like to describe that is nutrition is permissive to growth. It is your resistance training and the rest of the environment that is able to produce it. You kind of have to think of yourself as a farmer. It's more agriculture than it is sport performance when we're talking about hypertrophy. You want to create the environment, the sleep, the recovery, the stress, the macronutrient, the energy surplus, the micronutrient conditions, which maximize your response to training. So, but without training, none of that matters. If you're in a surplus, no matter how healthy your diet will be, you're going to gain body fat. That means that if bulking is code and bro speak for a reasonably high surplus, that is going to be less effective, or it may be as effective as it can be for muscle growth, but it will also result in fat mass gain. And that's why bulking and cutting cycles are less helpful the more advanced you get, and not necessarily necessary. And then I think the historical context of why they're there is important. First, they came out of the bodybuilding culture, and they existed before there was drugs, but drugs modified them. And that's because you have to get to a counterproductive level of leanness to compete in bodybuilding, which means you need to put back on that body fat to be healthy and be able to gain muscle mass purposefully. Bodybuilders don't stay shredded year round. So that means they must go through cut and bulk cycles. And because they're lauded as the experts in muscle growth who achieve the most impressive physiques, we assume we have to follow suit. Drugs compounded this. Now we have people who can gain substantial amounts, and at least in the 90s and 80s, in that phase of anabolic drug culture and bodybuilding, you would go on and off cycle. That's changed because the amount of muscle mass you have to sustain means you just need more area under the curve. And at best, you get kind of blast crews like high dose, low dose, or higher dose, lower dose. So now you don't even have that kind of reinforced bulk cut mentality that existed in the early stage bodybuilders of going, right, I'm going to go on a 16-week cut, change my drug protocol, lose weight. You even have some people who use the drugs to drive muscle growth coming into the show and drive their body fat down, just like that cohort in Rosnick saw, but accelerated by drugs. Like you'll see some people lose body weight, might go up a little bit, then maintain, depending upon the strategy they take during contest prep. And they're losing body fat to support the growth of the drug protocol they're using. And it seems to break the laws of physics. It doesn't. It has to do with the energy content of adipose tissue versus muscle mass. But I think that confuses people. And people think that bulking and cutting is necessary. Now, just because it's not necessary doesn't mean that it's not sometimes a good idea to go through purposeful surpluses and deficits, which I would make distinct from a cut and a bulk, because a bulk does seem to imply a relatively large surplus. An interesting thing that we found in our study, because we had 3 groups and we gave them either the intention of a 15% calorie surplus, a 5% calorie surplus, or neutral energy balance. And then we analyzed them continuously, not between group differences, but just what happened. We plotted them across a graph of who gained more weight and how did that impact skin folds and also muscle thickness changes. We saw that even though we asked people to follow a 5% surplus and a 15% surplus, those groups ended up with a similar average change in body mass, meaning that when you ask someone to go into a 5% surplus and they're a recreationally trained lifter with a reasonable amount of experience with tracking macros, even when they have an RD watching their body weight and talking to them, kind of like we do as an online coach, having them adjust their calories, a 5% surplus is probably too hard to follow. It's too minute. So yeah, on paper, an advanced lifter might only need to be in a 20 calorie surplus per year to support their growth. And ideally, you'd want that to match your day-to-day energy intake, but that's nearly impossible. But can people actually do that? And the would suggest, and reason would suggest, probably not. So when you're actually working with someone who's more advanced, you may need to do cut and bulk cycles, because logistically, a 100 to 200 calorie surplus is probably all that they can consistently be in, without just going, constantly in and out of a deficit, which is probably less than ideal. And then you have to go, okay, well, what do I do about that? If I only need a 20 calorie surplus to grow muscle, but I'm on average in 150 calorie surplus, that other 130 calories is probably going to go to body fat. So that means every 3, 4, 5, 6 months, I might need to do a mini cut to clean up. You don't have to do that. You could also just try to body recomp, be at maintenance or in a slight deficit, and try to do what Rosnick did in their 8-week study with the control group, but do it over the period of 8 months, and you're just accepting less than ideal gains. But there are limits to recomping, because that means you are losing body fat, and there is a point where your body will not get leaner while building muscle. That's why people lose muscle on diets. That's why bodybuilders don't stay shredded. If we could recomp our way all the way to 5% body fat while growing muscle, well, you can do that with drugs, like I was mentioning earlier. But for natural athletes, you can't. You get to a point where you fall below your lower intervention point, which we sometimes describe as a quote-unquote body fat set point. And now you're basically in a perpetual state of low energy availability. Your sleep gets disrupted. You're very food focused, so it's hard to even stay there. And your endocrine system gets disrupted. Your immune system gets disrupted. You're more likely to get ill, get hurt, and you're not producing as much testosterone to even support your baseline level of muscularity. So you can't just get down to 8, 7, 6% body fat and seeing commensurate increases in muscle mass. But you can recomp a fair bit. But I think it's just important to understand that if you're in the teens as far as body fat as a male, or the 20s as a woman, and you've been lifting a while, it's just not going to be happening at any kind of pace that is useful. And once you get below your lower intervention point, it's pretty much just not going to happen. unless you're going on a really novel training stimulus and you're actually functionally like an early stage intermediate.
All right. One last question to tie into nutrition. I know you just posted about this. So you guys published a piece in Mass evaluating evidence about high protein diets and potential health risks. And this seems to hang around. Is there anything for anyone to worry about? The kidney damage is the big one. We sometimes get some stuff about bone loss. Is there anything else, any other myths that people hear? And is there any evidence to support this stuff? I know that Joey Antonio has done, there's research that he's done in the past with very high protein intakes. I think it's almost like upwards of 4 times body weight in grams per day. And they didn't see any negative outcomes then. Talk to me about this.
Yeah. So the experimental research is always limited because it's self-report. It's small cohorts, and we're looking at 2 years tops. But yeah, we don't see that in Jose Antonio's research. The answer to your direct question of is there any evidence to support this? The answer is no, not in healthy populations. There are exceptions to that. When someone has actually developed metabolic disease or type 2 diabetes, their insulin response to protein changes a bit. The way they handle branched chain amino acids becomes quote unquote dysregulated. And you can see associations between in a surplus, in the presence of metabolic disease. You can see that as a contributing factor, but that's not the same as it causes the development of it. Likewise, in someone with chronic kidney disease, you will see protein restriction, at least in early and moderate stages of advancement of the disease, result in a slowing or even a reduction in symptomology. But that is not to say that high protein diets result in chronic kidney disease. If anything, there's actually some studies showing the opposite. And that the increases we see in glomerular filtration rate, which is just basically the pace at which the kidneys excrete things. They get rid of stuff. That's what they do for us. That increased rate is more a reflection of a positive adaptation and a more healthy kidney, because it actually co-varies with other markers of improved kidney health, and it still stays within normal ranges when you give healthy people higher protein diets. But when you give someone with chronic kidney disease a higher protein diet, you're taking an already scarred, damaged kidney, and then you're asking it to do more work, and it seems to worsen symptoms, and protein restriction seems to help. Those are the only 2 scenarios where there's even a glimmer of support for the concept of high protein diets harming health, at least within the ranges that have been observed in normal populations. And in other cases, it's been directly refuted by data. So is there evidence? No. But that's not the same thing as saying we have fully falsified this concept. We have fully falsified certain concepts, like that it leads to calcium losses that are actually due to bone resorption, not just a reallocation of dietary calcium. And in fact, when you see people with adequate dietary calcium and adequate vitamin D intake, high protein diets are associated with better bone mineral density and less fracture risk in the elderly. And like I said, with kidney health, higher protein diets are generally associated with slightly better outcomes. Type 2 diabetes, when we use a high protein diet in the context of treatment, when an overall healthy dietary pattern and a caloric deficit, it seems to enhance markers of metabolic health. So, lower postprandial glucose, loss of visceral fat, loss of fat mass, better insulin response, all that good stuff. And the same thing is true of just overall healthy aging. When you look at associations between protein and especially plant-based protein, fish, dairy, and egg, you generally see lower risk of fall incidence and all-cause mortality, and more markers of health in elderly populations who eat more protein. So there's a few instances where I think we do need more research in populations that are predisposed to or already on the pathway or have developed certain diseases like chronic kidney disease or metabolic dysregulation, type 2 diabetes, where we do want to investigate whether or not protein is contributing to that already disease state or the development of it. But in all other cases, it doesn't seem to be contributing to anything. So I'd say no.
Fantastic. I don't know if the mic is picking up the actual thunderstorm that's going on outside now that rolled in. Wonderful. Eric, this has been a treat. I appreciate everybody who's come along for the ride for this. They can follow you at Helms 3 DMJ on Instagram. They can definitely go and pick up the Muscle and Strength Pyramid books. Any other resources you want to direct people to? You guys podcast. Oh, but make sure I got this right. Iron Culture. That's the one. No, actually, that's not you. That's Eric Trexler, and that's Lauren Clenzo Semple, right? Yes.
No. That Front Page Fitness
Okay.
is Lauren Clenzo Semple and Trexler, and that is our other sponsored by Mass podcast. But Iron
Yes.
Culture is myself and Trex. He
Thanks,
is the
yes.
one who's on both.
Right.
So yeah,
Gotcha.
definitely check out Iron Culture presented by Mass. That's probably the other place where we have these long, in-depth conversations that are specifically relevant to lifters. Yeah, and I appreciate it.
Awesome. And everybody who's been tuning into all these, thank you guys again. I appreciate it. Put this in the hands of someone. There's probably going to be some trainers, the research nerds especially, are going to just eat this one up. So share that with them. Anybody who enjoys Eric. And again, thanks for taking the time. And I'm going to be continuing to bring you guys amazing guests. So share it around. Thank you guys.